the beginning of this year, I decided that I wanted to read 22 books in 2022, and I made a list of the books I wanted to read. Now, I actually read 32 books this year, but only 9 of them were from that 22 books, which is okay. I'll get to those other books sometime next year, hopefully. But I didn't realise that I had completed my goal of reading 22 books until I was already like 5 books over. And that's because I often read one book at a time, and then I just set the book aside and move on and to the next book and kind of forget what I've read. And halfway through the year when I realised this, I kind of got really sad. There are thousands and thousands of books in the world, and I'll only ever be able to read a very small selection of them. And so I want to be able to remember what I've read. So my solution to that was creating a reader's journal, and it's about almost up to date now. But I thought, why not also make a digital version so that I have a record of the books I've read this year and what I thought about them. So I read 32 books this year, I think, or it'll be 32 by the time the year ends. And so I thought I would go through them and share my thoughts on them, just for myself, so that I can remember what I thought about these books. The first book I read was The Ship of Theseus. It's also called S. It's a very interesting book. I love the concept. I ranked the concept 5 out of 5, but the execution was kind of lacking for me. I think maybe I just found it a bit too confusing. Maybe I would enjoy it more on a second read through. But basically you have this main story, The Ship of Theseus, which is a bit dry and stuff like that, but really cool. It plays on the thought exercise of, you know, The Ship of Theseus, which you should search up because it's crazy cool. And then there are 2 people that have found this book and are writing in the margins, trying to work out who this mysterious author is. It was really cool, kind of liked it, kind of didn't. I gave it 3 stars. There were some great quotes in it though. The second book I read was To Kill a Mockingbird. The only way I can describe this book is relief that it is such a classic. I gave this book 5 out of 5. Oh my god, I absolutely loved it, and I just can't explain how happy I am that this is a classic. The fact that this book was written in the 1950s and yet is still relevant today. I understand people who often are forced to read it as part of school don't enjoy it that much, and if I had to analyse it, it might take away from my love of this book. But I read it in a day. Oh my god, 5 stars. It's a brilliant book. The next book I read was Prisoners of Geography. This book I gave 3 stars to. It was okay. It was a good book, but it's a bit, you know, it's non-fiction, it's a bit dull at times. But I read this book just before war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, and it talks about how countries are influenced by their geography and how the politics within a country is directly affected by their geography. And I kind of like predicted and explained why war between Russia and Ukraine and that kind of area was inevitable. And so I would highly recommend having a look at it and seeing what you think. The next book I read was The Storyteller by Dave Grohl. Oh my god, this book I gave 4 stars to. It was brilliant. I loved it. It really gave me a new appreciation for music. I'm not someone who grew up listening to like 70s, 80s, 90s music, and so a lot of the references kind of went over my head, but it just made me love music so much more. And it was really cool just seeing his experience and learning about his life. His love of music really got carried over to me in the book, and I absolutely loved it. A 4-star book, definitely. The next book I read was Quit Like a Millionaire. At the beginning of the year I was really interested in investing and saving money, and I thought this book would be a good one to read because it was okay. I gave it 2 stars. Moving on. I then read The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama and Howard Cutler. Yeah. It was a good book. I gave it 3 stars. It had some important lessons in it. I'm glad I read it. Really focusing on how relationships kind of form our basis of happiness, and if we want to be more happy we need to have put less emphasis on physical things. I think it's the 7th book that I read now is Wild by Cheryl Strayed. I don't know what I was expecting when I read this book. It's about a through hike, but she was woefully unprepared, and it's about her experience with that, you know, when her first learning about it and then just having a crisis, like a life crisis, and just jumping straight onto the trail. And I only gave it 2 books, I think because it was somewhat infuriating at times, her lack of knowledge, but it was really cool learning about through hiking and her experience doing it in like the 90s, 2000s, because a through hike is something I really want to do. Alrighty, another book, The Courage to be Disliked. I heard this book recommended a lot and I decided to read it. I gave this book 3 stars. It was good. you know, took a lot of lessons from it, but it also kind of the conversation between the two individuals annoyed me a little bit at times. The next book I read was The Happiness Equation, and I only gave this book 2 stars. It just kind of repeated the same information as other books, but in a worse way, so. Then I read Range. Oh my god, I loved it. I gave it 4 stars. I really like how it incorporated its research in an interesting manner, and there were a lot of stories that kind of I had never heard about and kind of blew my mind, like the musicians in Italy centuries ago, and it was really cool to read these stories. And also as someone who doesn't really know what I want to do and kind of feels forced and pressured by society to specialise early, like I'm 19 and I'm expected to know the career I want to have, really cool to think about a different way of looking at things and how, you know, it's often you're more successful if you can combine a bunch of different seemingly unrelated, you know, topics of expertise together, and that's where new understanding is being gained now. Rather than trying to push forward the brink of science at this end, it's when we combine and link things together that most profound knowledge is being gained right now. So I gave this book 4 stars. It was a great book. The next book I read was a classic called The Alchemist. I gave this 3 stars. It was good. It was okay. Like, I'm glad I read it. It's a classic. I can understand why people don't like it. I can understand why people like it. Yeah, not much to say on that really. Then I read a book called I Catch Killers, which is about an Australian detective and his memoir basically. I gave this book 2 stars. I mean, it was interesting exploring his life, but I think this sums it up. For someone who's called his memoir I Catch Killers, he sure hasn't caught many of them. That's kind of my, you know, gist of it. It was cool. He seems like a cool person, but 2 stars. Another book that I read that only got 2 stars is The 4-Hour Workweek. I read half of this a year or 2 ago, and I went back to finish it this year, and I barely finished it. A lot of people consider it like a classic self-help book, and I can see how people, if someone has never really considered working for themselves and are very much in this concept of, you know, 9 to 5, work until you retire and then live your best life, I understand how it can be revolutionary and kind of reshape the way they think. But for me, it was just like, this is a bit dated. Yeah, I just didn't really enjoy it. I only gave it 2 stars. This is like the 3rd time I'm trying to record this, so I've been talking a lot. Now we're on to The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. This book, when I first read it, I only gave it 2 stars, but looking back on it, it's a 3-star, maybe 3.5 star book. It has some really great quotes and insights into it, but I think I got a bit bored and lost while I was reading it. The quotes in it just, like, there were so many things that I'm like, oh, I know this, but this person really articulates it well, let's underline it. That's that kind of book, you know? This other book I read, this is about halfway through the year, I read The Modern Explorers. I've been really interested in exploring and adventures most of my life, and this book is just a collection of 39 different adventurers, and I gave this book 3 stars. It was really cool seeing all these different stories, but it just made me think, wow, some humans do incredibly stupid things. But it was also really cool seeing how people complete their goals and challenges, and it made me want to be even more of an explorer. I was reading it in like a long car journey, like a 12-hour car journey, so I read it all, but it's the kind of book that you read like one person's story and then forget about. The next book I read was called 4,000 Weeks. I'd heard this book talked about a lot and I decided to read it. The idea is that if you live to 80, you live about 4,000 weeks. So it's about like time and what it means to live and trying not to waste time. It was pretty good. I gave it 3 stars. My mum tried to read it. She found it quite dry and very hard to get through, but there were some very poignant quotes in the book that really made me think about how I'm using my time and whether I'm using it the way I want to. And it also gave me an appreciation for how short life is, which I think is a very important thing to always hold on to. Then I read a book called The Year or Less, which is about an author's journey to not spending for a year basically, and really trying to break her addiction to consuming. I am deeply fascinated and interested in that, so it was really cool to read, but I only gave it 3 stars. Again, I don't know, I kind of reserve 4 or 5 stars to books that really make me feel something emotionally, and this was a good book, interesting to read about, but 3-star book. It was really cool though to see how she drastically cut out like everything in her life and how it actually made her happier. And it's really inspired me to do my own sort of thing, you know, not spend for a year. Then I read a book called The 138 Dates. It was, I gave it 2 stars. It wasn't, like, it was interesting, but it kind of seemed like she was more talking about her business than trying to find a partner. It was an odd book. There's a lot of books. The next book I read was Rich Dad Poor Dad. I also gave this book 2 stars. I found that by the 2nd chapter I was just reading the summaries because it kind of restated the entire chapter again. But it's a very short book that really, if you don't really have any idea about money and how money works, it's good to just get a kind of foundational understanding from this book. But I only gave it 2 stars. I can see how it's used to other people, but for me it was like, okay. The next book I gave 5 stars to. It was brilliant. It's not a book that I would recommend to other people, but it's called On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and I've seen this book around lots of places and a lot of people rate it very highly, and I understand why. It is such a beautifully poetic book, but it also has a kind of grotesque element to it, which was really fascinating to read, and I loved it. I think it definitely deserves the kind of prizes and stuff that it's won. It is beautiful, but again, I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's very much a book you've got to decide to read by yourself. I would let people know that the book was a great book, but I wouldn't say, hey, you should read this book, because, I don't know, maybe I just don't know someone well enough to recommend this kind of book to them. The next book I read was The Third Door. This book I gave 3 stars to. It was interesting to see his like entrepreneurial journey and how he, you know, made this book happen and how he got to interviewing all these different people. But I found that he learnt very slowly, and it was almost infuriating to see him make the same mistakes over and over and not really learn from them. That's just like the way it came across to me in the book. And so it's a good book, and it's nice to see, you know, learn from his mistakes and his way of, you know, getting into that entrepreneurial like kind of Silicon Tech Valley world and talking to all these big name people. But he did some things that I'm like kind of cringe me about. But the way he got started, it's a cool book. The next book I read, I think it's an Aussie book called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. This was an awesome book about a boy with autism and the murder of a dog. I gave it 4 stars. My friend recommended it to me. She said it was awesome. I agree. It was a brilliant book, and the way it's written really kind of is a different style of writing that most people don't often see, that kind of tries to mimic a different way of thinking, which is really cool to read. And then I started reading a lot of fantasy books, just somehow came up across them. The first fantasy book I read was A Wizard of Earthsea. This book I gave 3 stars to. I would consider reading the next book in the series, but I found it quite detached. But from reading a few other fantasy books recently, I kind of feel like that's a theme. You didn't really get a lot of time with each moment of his life. You kind of just, it's kind of like watching a documentary kind of race through his life, if that makes sense. And it's a really interesting world, and he has a really interesting life, so you're not really bored, but you lack that kind of deep connection with him, with the character. But I found that most fantasy books that I've been reading recently kind of do the same in a way. Not really, but again, I don't know, it's just like this happened and then this happened and this happened, and often it's from their point of view a bit, so you do have that connection. But yeah, I gave it 3 stars. I was just looking for a bit more, but it was a really cool story. Then I read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and this was the next book that I gave 5 stars to. I loved this book. It was brilliant. I really want to read more Taylor Jenkins. I also like that one of the main characters' names is Monique, so, you know, instant connection there. But it was just really cool. It deserves my 5 stars. Like, it was written in a way that I really loved, and the story was interesting. It was like stepping into a different multiverse, you know, this could have happened in a different version of Earth kind of thing. The next book I read was the last book that I gave 5 stars to this year, The Song of Achilles. Both of these books are very much TikTok famous, and I've heard about them for ages before I finally got around to reading them, and I loved The Song of Achilles so much. Again, it's one of those kind of beautiful books, and although like the ending is sad, and I think a lot of people were very emotionally distraught by it. I kind of found it more beautiful and sweet in a way. Okay, spoilers, because I have to talk about this book. So, the fact that they lived so much of their life together and they died in almost a way that they agreed to. They died loving each other. It was sad, but I can't help but think that they had such a beautiful life. And even though it was relatively short, it's not as short as some people get. And just because it was shorter than, you know, they would have liked, that doesn't mean their life was any less complete. So the fact that I'm crying over fictional characters, it is a 5-star book that I think everyone should read, and my love for Greek mythology just kind of amplified that. I was reading about all these characters that I've loved for years. Oh, it was a gorgeous book. I then read another very hefty book, as in emotionally tolling, Mouse. I read the first graphic novel of it, and it's about the Holocaust, but it's also about the son of a Holocaust survivor, and he's dealing with guilt of not sharing the experiences his ancestors, his father, experienced, but then the guilt of being a survivor from the Holocaust as well. I gave 4 stars too. I loved it. I think it's such an important book, and it was really cool to read. Then I read a fantasy book called The Poppy War. I was kind of let down by this book. I gave this book 2 stars. I think that's mostly because of the ending. I really disliked the ending so much. And again, I didn't really feel that strongly connected to the characters. It doesn't deserve my 2-star rating. I'm giving that rating out of pettiness. But it was weird to be in a world that kind of incorporated magic, but also in a way that was like, magic is definitely a real part of this world, but was also then like, well, actually, it could not be. It could just be, you know, these characters have a strong belief in it, and we could actually be in, you know, a story and myth from Earth. I don't know. It just wasn't for me. The next book I read was The Tomorrow War. This is an Australian book that has a lot of Australian slang, and that was really cool to read. I gave it 4 stars. Again, it was just a unique way of telling a story that I really enjoyed. It's written from first person, but in a way that I just love more than I normally do. It kind of left on a cliffhanger. I don't think there's a sequel, but it was just really cool to be in the head and lives of these teenagers from outback Australia going through an apocalyptic event, basically. It was really cool. I then read another fantasy book. I just happened to stumble across this book at an op shop just before I was going away for 2 weeks, and I needed a book for the plane and all of that, so I decided to buy it for like $2. It was called The Assassin's Apprentice. And oh my god, it turned out to be one of my favourite books. I gave it 4 stars. It was a really good book. I'm desperate to read the sequel. It was a really cool fantasy book that kind of, again, followed his journey from when he's 6 years old to being 15, and all of the events that happened to him. But it was such an incredibly cool kind of, I don't know, I loved it. I can't wait to read the next book. The second and last book I read is another very currently famous book called Where the Crawdads Sing. I gave this book 3 stars. Parts of it were good. I really enjoyed the first half of it, kind of her journey and growth. Okay, the only way I can talk about this book is through spoilers, so be warned. I liked this book, but it only got 3 stars for me because of the ending. The fact when they suggest or almost blatantly state that she did in fact murder him. When I was reading the trial, I was like they put too much opposing evidence, you know, that eventually got her out, that it was almost too unbelievable for me to be able to understand, oh yes, how they said she did it is actually what happened. To the most part, it seems that she actually did do it. Yeah. I didn't enjoy that part. So I liked the rest of it, but the ending, not so much. And the last book I read this year is called Entangled Life. This book I gave 3 stars to. It was really interesting to see how fungi influences our lives and how it's influenced evolution. And it's not something I've ever considered before. I've never really thought of fungi as an entire classification, like animals, plants, fungi. I didn't really comprehend how separate it is and how important it is for life survival and for our survival. And it was just really cool, but again, it was also a bit dry at times and a bit hard to get through. So I was learning all these cool things, but also it was taking me like the entire month of December to get through. And that's it. That's all the books I read this year. It's a heck of a lot of books, a heck of a lot of talking. I've done half of this twice already because I couldn't quite comprehend how I wanted to do this and whether I wanted to read quotes from the books. But it's done now. Oh my god. Books just make me feel things. They make me grow, they expand my understanding of the world, and I love them so much. I hope it's legible. I hope I was able to pronounce my words properly. I hope I wasn't talking too fast, and I wonder if people agree with me with what I say about these books. See ya!